Hello, MAGWest, and welcome to our panel, Settling for Catan, wherein we will tell you that, Catan sucks and you should play better games. Anyway, I'm Max.
And I'm Clayton, and together we are the foundation for the preservation of Gen 1 Pokemon. You can follow us on Twitter at 5th Gen, not PKMN. That's at 5th Gen, not PKMN. And before we get started with the panel, I would like to say to all those who are not going to subscribe to our Twitter or just have wrong opinions, like that Catan is a good game, you should stop being wrong. It's just so we can stop doing panels about the easy stuff and move on to the interesting opinions.
What are our interesting opinions?
I mean, I guess a basic one would be that wave dashing is bad, for one.
Sure, I don't know, man. I play Kirby. I don't know anything about competitive Smash. Anyway, let's talk about making board games great again. Except, we're not really. We're kind of in a board game renaissance right now. If you look at the board games that are coming out now compared to the board games that used to come out, there's a pretty big disparity. So it's a little less 2016, Make America Great Again, and a little more 2020, Keep America Great, or in this case, Keep Board Games Great, because the only thing I care about at this point is board games, given how terrible 2020 is.
Amen.
Are we going to be
Can we
okay?
mulligan this whole year, please?
Yeah, make conventions great again by letting us go to them. Anyway, here's a graph of number of board games published per year. The blue lines are the board games, and the red lines are the expansions. So if you notice, there's kind of like this big jump in the number of annual board games published per year starting in around the 70s. And then once you get to around 2000, the number of board games that publish just shoots through the roof. In fact, nowadays, more board game expansions get published per year than just board games entirely in the 90s. And we get new board games a year now than we did for the first 70 years of this last century. Which is really upsetting when you realize that everything you've been playing as a child takes place in the first 60 or 70 years of the century. I mean, Battleship, Sorry, Monopoly, Candyland, Scrabble, Risk, all of those games came before 1960. There are things that not only your parents played as children, but your grandparents played as children. And I don't know about you, but I don't like it when I let my grandparents make decisions for me. Otherwise, we know what happened last time the elder people decided what to do with our country.
Anyway, let's talk about Monopoly to start with. Before any of you've grown too much, let me just say that as much as most of you probably agree with us that Monopoly is a poorly designed game, it's not an opinion that is universally held, which means we can't stop yet. And B, it turns out that it's a good place to start just in general because it is such a well-known game. Virtually everybody who has heard of board games has heard of Monopoly, and part of that has to do with Monopoly's straightforward core mechanics, which conducive to it becoming a very popular board game, not so conducive to it being well-designed. The first of these core mechanics, of course, roll and move, which is exactly what it says on the box. You roll some dice, and you move that many spaces. Roll and move, the one advantage this mechanic has going for it is basically just that it is easy. It takes very little effort to explain it. You can basically just say, yeah, you roll the dice and add the number and move. It's very quick to understand, and you can get started playing right away. The problem with roll and move is that it is not at all conducive to player interactivity. That is to say, in a roll and move game, you don't decide what to do on your turn so much as the game decides what you're going to do on your turn, and you just have to make the most of that decision that has been made for you. So that is to say that you could basically write a Python script that would play Monopoly for you about as well as any human player would play the game, and that would be more fun than playing a game of Monopoly. Next up, the most meaty of Monopoly's mechanics is set collection. Set collection in most other games generally refers to basically a set of objects, board positions, etc., that individually give you bonuses, but if you get the entire an additional bonus on top of that. That is to say, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. In Monopoly, as the name suggests, you are trying to monopolize certain blocks of the city so that you can jack up the rent by building improvements such as hotels and houses on top of them. Which lends itself well towards the next mechanic of Monopoly, player elimination, which is to say, if you go bankrupt, you're out of the game, which would be bad in a 3+ hour game if players are being knocked out half an hour into it, except for the fact that it actually means that they're free from having to play a game of Monopoly, so it's actually a net bonus in that case. Not just mechanically, though. Monopoly has some thematic problems as well. That is, and the most striking of these is the fact that Monopoly features beggar tycoons. And by that, I mean, you know, the whole premise is that you're swagging your way down New York City. You're buying up every property you see. You're really sprucing the place up with some really nice sofas made of rich Corinthian leather that you've managed to import. And once you've set this up, instead of, you know, just staying in this property you've built like a normal person, you still insist on couch surfing at your buddy Bubba's place in Baltic for some reason. And because you still have to pay rent at other people's properties in order to, you know, find a place to sleep for the night, it very much encourages white-collar crime, because the best strategy is actually to stay in jail as long as possible once you've bought up all the property, to make it so that the taxpayer is paying your rent instead of you paying your rent. Think of it as a preemptive bailout of sorts. Which isn't going to save you from the last mechanic of familial disownment, which isn't great if you value normal functioning family dynamics or like having friends, but is much better if you are looking for an excuse to not talk to your weird uncle anymore.
You have no idea how many wills I've been written out of over Monopoly. Anyway, so I guess we should talk about Catan, which is the game that people sometimes go, hey, well, you know, Monopoly's not that great, but Catan's fucking great. And those people are wrong, but, you know, let's try to start honest here. Let's go over what makes Catan interesting to people who, you know, have grown out of Monopoly but don't understand that there are more board games out there. So, Catan's economic engine is more dynamic than that of Monopoly's. In Monopoly, your economic engine is just, you know, buy properties and collect a set, and there you go. In Catan, it's a little more interesting because what you do is you build towns and you build cities on the board, and those give you resource production, which you can use to buy either like development cards or more towns and cities to give you more resource production. So you have a more dynamic economic engine than in Catan. As far as player interactivity goes, negotiation's a lot more interesting in Catan. Monopoly has a lot of rules that explicitly disallow you from doing weird sweetheart deal negotiations midway through bankruptcy, which is basically how everyone plays the game anyway. Where in Catan, the negotiation is basically trying to trade resources with other players, and just like trading properties in Monopoly, never do it, because the last thing you want to do is help your opponent. Helping your opponent is how you lose games. Excluding that, Catan's player interactivity is limited to rolling a 7, getting top decking the right infrastructure development card, or kind of cutting them off on the map so they can't, you know, build somewhere, which is something. Like it's something. The final mechanic of Catan that people like kind of scream about is hand management. In Catan, as you gather resources, they go into your hand. So your hand is your resources. On your turn, you can choose to spend your resources to do things, build stuff, whatever. Or you can sit on them and hope you can do something bigger later at the risk of someone rolling a 7 and causing you to get robbed and losing half of your stuff. There's also the hand management of your development cards and playing those strategically, though there is a lot of top decking in there. So those are like the mechanics of Catan that people claim make it a good game. It's economic engine, it's like negotiation, player interactivity, and it's hand management. So I think we have to go through and point out games that do each of those mechanics significantly better. Starting with economic engine. So we're going to talk about the game of Puerto Rico. Not the hurricane, the actual game, Puerto Rico. There we go. So in Puerto Rico, you are running a plantation colony in the Caribbean, and your goal is to run the best plantation colony in the Caribbean. Very, very deep, thematic, interesting, whatever. The nice thing about Puerto Rico is it takes a little bit longer than Catan. So where in Catan's a game that's like just long enough to be a commitment, but not so long that it's like a main event, Puerto Rico is able to be like a main event game that you still isn't so long that you can also play some other stuff on the side. But what makes Puerto Rico interesting is how its economic engine works in comparison to Catan's. In Catan, you build cities and towns to collect resources, but when it comes down to it, the resources you gather are dependent entirely on dice, making the economic engine of Catan a glorified roll-and move. In Puerto Rico, it's significantly different. Your resources are effectively buildings, plantations, workers, and money. You use the money to buy buildings, and you use the workers to work your plantations and buildings. If you work the right plantations and buildings, you will produce goods, which you can then use to make money to buy more buildings, or get points to win the game. So it creates a lot of different ways for you to interact with your resources, and depending on how you want to do a strategy, it incentivizes certain resources over others. Additionally, in Puerto Rico, you are not susceptible to the whims of dice to dictate what you do. No one sits through a game of Puerto Rico and goes, man, if I just rolled 8 more 9s, maybe I would have won. Because that's not how the game works. In Puerto Rico, you have variable phase order, which means on your turn, you will choose one of several different actions that you want to have occur for not just you, but every player. So if on your turn you want to make goods, you can go, I want to make goods, and then you will produce goods, and everyone else will produce goods. Which means that if someone else chooses the produce goods action instead of you, you will still produce goods. No one is ever at, like, the advantage people have in good production is entirely dependent on how they have created their economic engine. If Clayton, for example, is trying to go into tobacco but doesn't have the proper resources to make it happen yet, he's just going to have a bad goods turn, but it's entirely his fault. Wherein if I go hard corn, I'll have a great goods turn because corn is super easy to produce because, you know, it just falls off the fucking cob and you're good to go. But that's basically what makes Puerto Rico interesting. Clayton, you want to talk about a game?
Yeah. So next up, building on kind of the network building aspect of Catan to an extent, is Power Grid. Which, as the name suggests, is a game in which you are operating a municipal power company. Basically, you're trying to be the PG&E of your era, except hopefully starting fewer fires. And you're trying to build out your copper wire-clad octopus tentacles out to various cities across various different game boards so that you can pump power into their homes and pump money out of their wallets. Which by itself seems like a game that wouldn't really lend itself well to player interaction. It sounds very solitaire-esque, but you'd actually be very wrong about that, because much more so than Catan, Power Grid provides more tantalizing opportunities for player interaction by giving you reasons to, basically actions you can take that interact with other players by making their turn worse, essentially, which is actually worth doing. An example of this would be the auction phase, contrasted with Monopoly's auction phase, going back to Monopoly for a second, where you still get first, in Monopoly, you still get first pass on all properties you want to buy if you land on it, but if you pass on buying it, then it goes up for auction. In Power Grid, all power plant purchases, which are the primary engine you use to convert resources into money, are auctioned off, which provides for many different strategies you can employ. One of which is to just buy the power plants you want, like, you know, you would think you should do. But what you can also do is kind of bid on power plants you don't actually want to that you know your opponent really, really, really wants and needs to make their turn work, so you can force them to spend more money for it. Just don't get too carried away with it, or you might be caught holding the bag when they pass, and you're stuck having bought this power plant for way too much money that you actually can't use. So risk reward, but it's an interesting interaction nonetheless. This extends even beyond the auction phase and extends into resource management itself, because these power plants, as the first law of thermodynamics would suggest, can't just create power from nothing. They have to run on resources, which are available on the marketplace in the game. But interestingly, they're available on this marketplace on a sliding scale of price based on availability. So the more scarce a resource is, the more expensive it is to actually buy it, which means if you go before somebody and say you see that they have nothing but coal-powered plants, you can just buy up as much coal as you can and hoard it, so that either they can't buy coal if you succeed in buying all of it, which is totally something you can do, or at the bare minimum, you make their turn more expensive to carry out, which means they're going to have a worse turn. Again, it's something you can do to interact with other players that is actually worth doing. And both of these mechanics meld very nicely with the fact that Power Grid, unlike Catan, actively fights runaway leader syndrome. To explain what runaway leader syndrome is for just a second, Catan and other games like it tend to suffer from a phenomenon where once a player starts pulling ahead and winning, there's not really much the other players can do to catch up. Once somebody starts winning, they're going to keep winning because winning makes it easier to keep winning. In Power Grid, however, if you're in first place, you go last on picking auctions and buying resources, which means that it is that much easier for all the people behind you to screw you over exactly in the way that I have just described, to give you worse turns, which basically ends up with a situation where it's frequently the case in games of Power Grid where you don't actually know who's winning until right at the very end, which makes the game more exciting. It makes it feel easier to get invested because it feels like you still have a chance more often than not. And then lastly, we have Race for the Galaxy, dealing with the hand management mechanic that Catan employs, but Race for the Galaxy employs it better. To briefly explain, Race for the Galaxy is a game in which you are a spacefaring civilization that has just discovered FTL travel. You start with a home planet and a space station, and you are out to conquer the stars. And you do this by basically playing down different planets from your hand that you draw from the deck. These cards represent planets, and they give you certain powerful abilities. It's frequently the case that individual planets can define your entire strategy, and really open up different avenues for playing the game. However, this is similar to basically building towns and roads, etc. in Catan, whereas in Catan, when you're building these towns and roads and whatnot, you have to decide basically whether you're going to spend that brick from your hand to build the road now or spend it next turn to build it later. In Race for the Galaxy, the bricks and sheep in your hand that you must spend are actually other planets. So it forces you to decide which cards you're going to burn as resources and which cards you're going to keep as actual cards to play. If this were it adds another layer to the hand management mechanic. If this were implemented in Catan, the best way to describe it would be as if instead of burning resources, you had to burn development cards to play settlements. All of a sudden, that decision about whether to build a settlement or not is a lot harder to make because there are some situations in which that development card might be better. However, Catan is not played this way, so instead you just have to decide whether you're going to trade wood for sheep.
Well, that's a dumb joke. So,
yeah,
I think, Clayton, I think we've empirically proven Catan sucks, right?
Oh, yeah.
Its
unequivocally.
economic engine, while compelling to someone who's played Monopoly, is still a glorified roll and move. Your ability to interact with players is still pretty shoddy at best.
And to the extent that it exists, it's actively a bad idea.
Yeah, you can, I don't know, you know who's going to win after 3 turns. That's pretty cool. It's just
Yep.
Clay, what would you rather play than Catan?
I would much rather play Living in Crippling Poverty, which is an exciting game with multiple mechanics, such as variable player powers. You know, sometimes you're really good at panhandling, and sometimes you know the guy who cooks the best meth. Both useful abilities to have in different circumstances. Next up, you also have commodity speculation. Sometimes after you go dumpster diving, you find a can of tuna that's only expired by 3 months. Which basically leads to a situation where whether or not you eat it just depends on how hungry you are. That's the sliding scale of edibility, so to speak. And lastly, there's a mechanic that was just introduced by the new expansion for this game. We've got set collection, wherein you're trying to collect as many stimulus checks as possible to complete the set, so to speak. Unfortunately, the set size of those is only 1. So it's not really a good strategy. So I would have to say 2 out of 10 expansion pack do not recommend getting at all.
So, I mean, I think an argument someone who knows what they're talking about is going to make against us is, well, you guys just hate Catan because it isn't this really deep, complex game. And that's not true. The games we did show are a little more complicated than Catan. That's for certain. However, there are plenty of other gateway games that are at a complexity level of Catan, if not simpler, that still hold up to repeated plays when compared to more complex and interesting games. Ticket to Ride is a very simple game where you just draw cards until you get a matching set and use it to build a train route in, like, trying to connect the country together. Seven Wonders is a little more complicated. It's a card drafting game where you pick cards and you use them to try to build an economy for an ancient civilization and get the most points through various methods of war, trade, science, and cool buildings.
And next up, we've got King of Tokyo, which, as the box suggests, is a game in which you're playing as a kaiju in Tokyo, beating up other kaiju, trying to become King of Tokyo. This game is designed to be playable by 8-year-olds, which means it is great as both a family game and a beer game with the buddies, or even just because it only takes like 20 minutes to finish a game. It's a great time waster game if you're waiting for that other guy to show up to your power grid night.
Yeah.
While this game does feature random mechanics, it features them more in the Dungeons and Dragons sense than the Candyland sense, in that they are more there to build suspense than they are to completely dictate the flow of the game.
I mean, the game's made by Richard Garfield, the guy who invented Magic the Gathering, so
it shows. It's a great game. Do recommend.
And then there are other games, if you don't want something that's like Catan-esque or a gateway, from Mysterium, which is, by all purposes, one of the most like immersive games I've played, wherein one person plays a ghost who fell on their head and thus can't clearly remember who killed them, so they have to communicate the mystery to other players through dreams, which are made through abstract art cards, like a snowman who's posing as if he wants you to paint him like one of those French girls. Or Viticulture, a game where you're trying to build the most competitive winery in turn of the 20th century Italy.
Or The Networks, a game in which you're trying to channel your inner Rupert Murdoch and dominate primetime television with your hit original series, the Emergency Broadcast Test Hour, and Let's Pickle.
I love Let's Pickle. Anyway, so with all that, I think we've skipped over the best board game. So
I think we have to.
If you haven't looked into it, Gloomhaven is the highest ranked board game on Board Game Geek by a country mile. The box is large enough to fit a small child in, and the rules are even crunchier than that kid's bones.
Max.
What?
I'm not talking about the best game on Board Game Geek. I'm talking about the greatest recreational activity ever devised by the species.
Sex?
That's a close second. I'm talking about the Jackie Chan Adventures game, which is a...
Clayton. That Board Game Geek ranking is infinity. The higher number is worse.
Sorry, I let that slide in by mistake. The one after it should fix it. There we go.
Shit.
Smaller numbers
right.
better,
This is
right?
best game.
Fantastic. So, Jackie Chan Adventures game is a game in which you and more players play as Jackie Chan and his parallel universe doppelgangers as they go about collecting ancient artifacts, defeating the forces of evil, and providing great moral lessons for the children while carrying out such excellent special attacks as Uncle Bug Crusher and Flying Fish Bobs whenever you challenge one of your doppelgangers to a Chan challenge.
Well, I mean, we have to buy that, obviously.
I actually did.
And with that,
I think you were there.
I was. So that's
yeah.
the panel. So we'd like to thank all of the things on the list. Reading all of them is too much work. You can
I will give a shout out to Snakes and Ladders, which, contrary to popular opinion, is actually the most deep and complex game ever invented. It turns out that to truly master it requires a PhD in statistics to adequately grasp probability to play it to its full potential.
I mean, that's true. It's the fairest game you can challenge death to in a game of life or him. Anyway, you can follow us on Twitter at 5th Gen, not PKMN. We'll let you know when we go to IHOP. After
just
the
in general,
yeah, IHOP's
not going to be
cool.
too often
it's
right now, but
way better than Denny's. I'll upload this panel on YouTube. 5th Gen.
We went to Denny's once, Max. It was a huge mistake.
Yeah, don't tell people that. I want.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
That's right. They need to think we're cool, Clayton. This is very important. Anyway.
That's true. Okay.
MAGWest, thank you so much for listening to us talk for no reason about board games that you don't care about. I hope all of you have a fantastic weekend. Enjoy the virtual convention and enjoy your lives. Or fucking whatever, man. Cool.
Signing off for now.